on this episode of Xploration Outer Space.
The shuttle is an amazing vehicle because it was so versatile.
There was a lot of pressure to get the flight rate up.
And with pressure came disaster.
It goes from grief to anger pretty fast.
But the space shuttle program accomplished a lot over 3 decades.
I wondered what the end of the shuttle program would mean to the country.
Join us as we look at the legacy of the space shuttle program.
We're here at Kennedy Space Center, the primary launch site for the space shuttle program. Now, this chapter of space exploration spanned 30 years, and along the way, advanced our understanding of outer space.
135 missions, deploying important satellites, conducting experiments in microgravity, and ultimately building the International Space Station. The space shuttle had an amazing run. The planning stages for this unique orbiter began in the early 1970s.
They finally, those in Washington, converged that we'll build a national space transportation system that will accommodate any number of customers, government agencies, Department of Defense, commercial, as well as space research. So we ended up with a very large payload bay. The concept was, we'll take your payload, whatever it may be, we'll take it up to orbit. If we deploy it and it doesn't work, we'll put it back in the payload bay and bring it back home.
In order to accomplish this, the orbiter needed to be completely reusable. It was designed so that when it returned to Earth, it would land like an airplane. Such a spacecraft had never been built before.
The first launch of the space shuttle was originally set for the late 70s, but the reality of developing this complex system set in, and it wasn't till 81 where we were finally on the launch pad and launch count. We had never flown the system before with the rockets, the external tank, and the orbiter unmanned, which had been the precedent in every other human spaceflight program. So it was considered to be a high-risk mission to an engineer. It was a test.
The 2 astronauts assigned to make this maiden voyage were Commander John Young and pilot Robert Crippen.
People have asked me what I was thinking about prior to that first flight. It was for me not to screw up. Yeah, a lot of people were depending on us. The 70s were not exactly a good time for America. We had the Vietnam War going on. We had problems with hostages in Iran that had been taken when our embassy was taken over there. And we hadn't been flying in space for a long time. The Americans really needed something to be proud of.
2 days earlier, the launch was scrubbed due to a technical problem. Would this finally be the day?
I wasn't overly confident that we were going to lift off. And it was only when the countdown got to within a minute of liftoff that I finally turned to John and I said, I think we might do it. And sure enough, we did. But it was truly a nice kick in the pants when we lifted off. In 8.5 minutes, you've achieved orbital speed, the engine's cut off, and you're floating around in 0G.
And Columbia, we got a terrific view.
And the rest of the mission, it behaved pretty much like we had planned. You know, I'd waited a long time to get into space, and for me, it was a thrill to be there.
Columbia, Houston, you guys did so good, we're going to let you stay up there for a couple days. Your Gopher on orbit.
The space shuttle test flight orbits the Earth for 2 days. The next big challenge would be its descent back through the atmosphere.
You start to hit some sensible atmosphere around 400,000 feet, but you could tell it was pretty hot outside, somewhere close to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit on the nose. It was a clear day. We were going to be landing on the lake bed out at Edwards Air Force Base, and I could look out and see there were thousands of people out on the lake bed to come out to watch this.
4, 3, 2, 1, down.
John did a beautiful job touching it down, and it was certainly for both he and I, it was a remarkable mission and a great day for us.
Coming up, with the dawning of the Space Shuttle program comes pressure from outside forces.
And that's when the reality set in and say, hey, this is just the beginning of a long marathon.
With the successful completion of the Space Shuttle's first orbital flight, employees at NASA let out a big sigh of relief.
When the mission ended up performing as advertised, that's when the reality set in and say, hey, it isn't over with this first mission. This is just the beginning.
Space Shuttle Columbia continues with the next 4 flights and then is followed by 3 other shuttles named Challenger, Discovery, and Atlantis. Their missions are varied, like deploying communication and weather satellites, conducting research in microgravity, and serving the Department of Defense with their top secret payloads.
The number one promise and goal was we're going to keep the cost low and we're going to fly frequently. We'll build a fleet of these which will accommodate a flight rate of 24 flights a year. That was the advertising brochure.
But the rate of flight falls well short of the promises made. In 1985, their most prolific year, they launched only 9 space shuttles. Although these orbiters are reusable, repairs need to be made after each flight.
Space is harsh on hardware. It's not a really friendly environment. You had to convince yourselves, particularly the engineers, that it was okay to fly this component one more time without replacing it with something new.
On January 28, 1986, a crew of 7 are scheduled to launch aboard Space Shuttle Challenger. On the morning of their launch, the temperature is close to 30 degrees Fahrenheit.
When it came time for Challenger, the predicted weather for launch day is going to be colder than we had ever experienced before on a launch count, but we have a set of launch mission rules. If we meet all the parameters, and there's thousands of them, and everything's in spec, there's no reason to not go fly.
73 seconds into its launch, the space shuttle explodes. The crew is lost. It's later determined that the cause was a failure of an O-ring seal on one of the solid rocket boosters. Witnessed by millions of viewers, the space shuttle program was dealt a blow that it might not recover from.
So it goes from grief to anger pretty fast. It's grief to anger.
Story Musgrave, an astronaut and engineer who had been with NASA since the mid-60s, was determined to fix the problem.
We reviewed the whole system, but the important thing was we took care of those people upstairs. The technical people took over. The technical people took over the organization and say, we're going to operate it based upon what it really is, not the dream of what it was supposed to be.
After the Challenger disaster, which took 7 lives, the shuttle program basically shut down for reevaluation. Would the program even continue? 2.5 years later, we got our answer.
We approached the next flight kind of like we're starting the program over again. This is like STS-1. You're betting your agency, your program on this next mission.
With redesigned solid rocket booster joints, the launch of Space Shuttle Discovery is successful. And once it returns to Earth and lands safely, the Space Shuttle program is back in business. Coming up, The space shuttle shows its diversity by deploying, retrieving, and repairing satellites. And sometimes the astronauts get a chance to appreciate the view.
I remember having this almost out-of-body experience thinking, am I really here? It's an incredible feeling.
This is Atlantis, the retired space shuttle here at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex. You can see how large the payload bay is. It was capable of carrying either 2 large satellites or a Space Lab module. And the 50-foot mechanical arm really came in handy, especially when they needed to gather in satellites that needed repair.
The space shuttle's versatility is put on display with its deployment and eventual repair of the Hubble Space Telescope. Weighing over 11 tons, the Hubble Space Telescope is delivered to an orbit 340 miles above the Earth.
The shuttle from the start, Department of Defense said it got to be 60 by 15 in the bay. We need that. The shuttle was a beautiful way to carry the Hubble up there.
Later, when it's discovered that the Hubble Space Telescope has a problem with its mirror placement, another space shuttle mission is sent to fix it. The robotic arm brings the telescope into the shuttle's bay for repairs.
It was a marvelous work platform. That big 60 by 15 bay, it's a shop.
Thanks to the space shuttle, with these repairs, the Hubble Space Telescope has opened up the whole universe with amazing images of distant galaxies. With a variety of missions, some scientific, some involving repair work, there were as many as 8 crew members on a single flight, and many of them were specialists.
As astronauts go, they were a little different. These are scientists, researchers. You look at the biographies of these people and think, wow, they could be a leader in industry or president of a college somewhere, but they flew well. They were a lot of fun to be around.
During the course of the entire program, there were 355 astronauts who flew aboard the space shuttle. And each time an astronaut was assigned to a mission, there was rigorous training involved. Some of the training prepared them for spacewalks. Spacewalks were needed to repair satellites and later on to assemble the International Space Station.
Before we even go into space, we spend hours upon hours in the neutral buoyancy facility. It's a huge pool. It's about 100 feet by 150 feet and around 60 feet deep. And it's deep enough that we can submerge pieces of the shuttle, so we learn how to operate in zero gravity.
Not every astronaut did a spacewalk, but every crew member did get the rare perspective of seeing planet Earth in its entirety.
It's truly a unique perspective to look back on this spaceship Earth that we're all fortunate enough to live on. Everybody that's flown it says there are no borders that you can see. It's just one place that we're all inhabiting, the place that we need to take care of.
Over a span of 3 missions, I think I really had an opportunity to appreciate the out-the-window view about 6 times. I remember when the sun first rose after my first launch, my first reaction was something like, oh my gosh, am I really here? It's an incredible feeling.
Coming up, the space shuttle spends nearly a third of its missions working on one specific goal.
The space shuttle was basically a construction truck to build the space station.
The space shuttle performed a lot of missions, deploying satellites, fixing satellites, and conducting a lot of microgravity experiments. But perhaps its biggest objective was building a space station.
The space shuttle was basically a construction truck to build the space station. But it could take up huge payloads, and it could use robotics to put these structures where you wanted. It could support spacewalks, so you could send 2 people out to torque things together with big wrenches, and it did an amazing job of building the space station.
and just lost 4 separate temperature transducers on the
On February 1st, 2003, the Space Shuttle program suffered its second disaster when Space Shuttle Columbia disintegrated as it re-entered Earth's atmosphere. 7 crew members were lost. And while it might have been tempting to shut down the Space Shuttle program, there was still one big reason to continue.
So ultimately, what probably was the major emphasis in keeping that program going was we've got to do the space station job, and the shuttle's the only system that can do it.
When the International Space Station was completed, it was then decided that the Space Shuttle program would be terminated. On July 8, 2011, Flight STS-135 would make the very last Space Shuttle launch. The commander for this final flight would be Chris Ferguson.
I wondered what the end of the shuttle program would mean to the country, and we really wouldn't know until that day. We realized how many people had come by to see the last space shuttle launch. There were tens of thousands just in the area of the Kennedy Space Center industrial area that you have to drive through to get to the pad. And we were sort of peeking between the shades looking out the window, and I think we were all amazed at how many people had showed up.
On this final mission, Space Shuttle Atlantis delivered a year's worth of supplies to the International Space Station and removed 3 tons of unneeded equipment and waste. This was a fitting demonstration of what the shuttle could accomplish. On July 21st, Atlantis returns to Earth.
I'd be lying if I didn't say there was an emotional moment or two. It wasn't just Atlantis that had come to a stop. It was really the way of thinking about space for the last 30 years had come to an end.
After serving the world for over 30 years, the space shuttle's earned its place in history and it's come to a final stop. God bless all of you. God bless the United States of America.
The Space Shuttle program used 5 orbiters to fulfill a variety of missions. It's been called the most amazing machine ever built by humans.
What is the legacy? What did it do for us? And I think it's twofold. One, it's a reminder that our nation, we can solve any technical issue given the commitment and the resources. And the other is the space station that's up there now, 250 some miles above. There's half a dozen astronauts up there doing a lot of work that will someday improve the quality of life down here.
You're watching Xploration Outer Space.
There were 135 missions in the Space Shuttle program, 2 of which ended in tragedy. Those tragedies are a somber reminder of the great sacrifices that were made to further explore our place in the universe.
If you want to push to new horizons, you're going to end up taking risks. Mankind has been doing that since we crawled out of the cave.
The temperatures and the pressures that rocket engines have to develop to escape Earth gravity are bordering on what mankind can design. So we're always operating near the edge.
The Space Shuttle was a unique program. Allowed us to do everything from some very important military missions that, in my opinion, helped win the Cold War. Allowed us to discover the universe and what's out there. And it will be a long time before we put together another vehicle that's anywhere near as capable.